presented by Caltech.
I'd now like to introduce Evren Gokcen. Evren is a senior majoring in electrical engineering. He's done 3 SURFs, and this past summer he worked with Dr. Pietro Perona.
All right, to start with an understatement, the brain is incredibly complex. It's made up of 100 billion neurons, 100 trillion connections, and as a result, it's profoundly difficult to understand how it processes information. Thankfully, we have imaging techniques like fMRI, CAT scans, or even light sheet microscopy that lead to better understanding of these processes and help us diagnose, say, illness or brain damage and so on. Now, in the realm of artificial intelligence, we have now deep neural networks, which are achieving similar levels of complexity. Some networks contain 100,000 neurons, 100 million connections, and even at these lower levels of complexity, they're also difficult to understand. So analogously, we have visualization techniques that lead to better understanding of these networks and help us diagnose, say, inefficiency or semantic errors and so forth. So my talk focuses on these final 2 bullet points. And in particular, there's going to be a central theme, which is that looks matter. I hope to show you the power of using visual methods to understand and improve deep convolutional networks. And so we'll cover 3 main sections. We'll start with a crash course in convolutional networks. Then we'll develop visual techniques to characterize how these networks see the world. And we'll extend those visual techniques to investigate and reveal some new information about an important training technique called fine-tuning. So let's start with that crash course. First, some context. I work in a computer vision lab, so I deal with images. And in particular, I worked with 2 image data sets. We have ImageNet, which consists of 1,000 image classes of, say, plants and animal species, such as the hen or the koala, and it contains 1.2 million images in that data set. Then we have NA-Birds, which only has 555 fine-grained classes of bird species, and it's much smaller with only about 50,000 images. And the NA-Birds dataset will become important in part 3. Our task is image classification. So we start with an input image, input it to our deep convolutional network, which then outputs a class probability, or a class prediction, probably a hen, probably a koala. And unfortunately for all of you, the inner workings of these deep networks are largely going to have to remain in this black box in the interest of time, but I will go over the most salient features. So here's a neural network, and to continue our brain analogy, we have individual neurons organized into these layers. And particular to convolutional networks is the characteristic that in any given layer, neurons only take input from a small subset of neurons in the layer below, in this case 3, indicated by these arrows. Furthermore, neurons in convolutional networks share weights. That's indicated by these arrows of the same color. And these sets of neurons that share weights are called feature maps, or I'll call them filters. And if you take anything away from this section, it should be that these filters are key structures for convolutional networks that allow us to visualize how they see the world. Now, on a global scale, a network might look like this, where we start with an input image, and we sequentially transform it via the feature maps that make up each layer in the network until we get to our output class prediction. And we can think of this process as a visual pathway. So your eye sees the image, and then via your neural pathways, it gets transformed into this abstract but more interpretable concept of a hen. And we'll actually get to visualize this pathway in part 2. But first, some quick vocabulary. I'll refer to shallow layers as layers that are closer to the input, say at this level, and deep layers as layers that are closer to the output, closer to the prediction. Now, regarding previous work and elucidating the concept of a feature, Yosinski et al. Showed that features in convolutional networks go from general, such as colors or lines, at shallow layers to become more class-specific, such as the scales of a fish or the feathers of a bird, as you get deeper and deeper in the network. And then Zeiler et al. Actually used visualization techniques to achieve state-of-the-art image classification with their convolutional networks. So we've already seen some of the power of these visual techniques. And that concludes our crash course. Remember that filters are the key structure of convolutional networks, that will form the basis of our visualization techniques. So now we can actually ask the network this question. And in particular, we're going to read the mind of a convolutional network, and then we'll try to quantify the intuitions we gain from that experience in a case study, where we compare the network representations of the hen versus koala image classes. So when we look at these images, we see a hen or we see a koala. But what does the convolutional network see? Returning to this slide, I'll actually show you a video that shows this very process. So we're going to visualize this pathway. And the way it's going to work is you'll see a filter that's at one of these shallow layers, and then we'll see that filter transform in a 19-layer convolutional network until we get to the final layer. And through that transformation, we'll see what features the network considers most important. So let's get right into it. Here we have our network, or our filter. It starts at a simple green image, then we get more complicated textures and less interpretable textures. But eventually we even see maybe some semantic features, circles, maybe eyes, scales, feathers. And as it continues to transform, these features get higher and higher level. Maybe we see beaks. Does anyone see a hen? Maybe multiple hens? So let's watch that again, but this time faster, and I won't say anything, so you can just absorb the information. So now we can answer that question, what does the convolutional network see? While we see our hen and koala, this and this are the best examples that the convolutional network would come up with for a hen or a koala. Now, while we see semantic features we would intuitively expect, the worldview of the network is certainly different from yours and mine. So now we'd like to quantify the intuitions we just gained from looking in that video in this way. We'll take a single filter, average the outputs of the neurons that belong to that filter to produce a single average value and plot it like so. We'll repeat this for all the filters in a layer to produce a distribution of filter activations. And it's this distribution that I call a representation of a particular type of data. And this brings us right to our case study. Now we want to look at how the network represents the hen versus the koala image classes. And in particular, we're going to try and characterize how similarity between the two classes changes with network depth. And it's difficult to tell that from these plots. So in order to get a better visualization, I'll plot the normalized activations of the koala class versus normalized activations of the hen class. And so for each layer, we get plots that look something like this. Now, if the two classes were represented identically at each layer in the network, we would expect each plot to have blue dots that perfectly follow these gray lines. Now, that's largely the case at shallow layers, but it's dramatically not the case for these deeper layers. And so we'd like to further summarize this trend by, let's say, plotting the R-squared values of each of these plots throughout the network. And so we get something like this. Indeed, the R-squared value deviates from 1 the deeper you go in the network. And so what are our conclusions from all of this? Well, from the video, we learned that features go from general to class specific, and from the case study, we learned that classes go from similarly represented to different. Now, you might be thinking, we already knew this information, and that's true, but the point of this exercise was to verify the validity of these visual techniques. So now we can confidently extend them to look at and reveal some information about this process called fine-tuning. So in this section, I'll introduce the concept of fine-tuning, and then we'll bring back our techniques to reveal some new information about the fine-tuning process and actually come up with a treatment plan of sorts for the inefficiencies that we discover. So to motivate the idea of transfer learning, I'd like to start with an analogy. Say you have two students that you're trying to teach to fly an airplane. One of your students has been practicing in a flight simulator, and the other student has not been doing that, and maybe hasn't even set foot in the airplane. Intuitively, the student that has been training on the flight simulator will pick up learning to fly the actual airplane much more quickly. So in the context of deep learning, this is our student who has never set foot in an airplane. Normally what we do, say we have a particular convolutional network architecture and we want to train it to classify bird species on the NA birds dataset. We might take randomly initialized features and use that as our starting state for the network, and then we'll train that network from scratch. And unfortunately, this can take days or even weeks on even the best processors today. And I can still have difficulties achieving the levels of performance that I want. So this motivates the idea of transfer learning. This is our student that has practiced on the flight simulator. In the context of deep learning, we have features that were pre-trained in the same convolutional network architecture. They were pre-trained on a larger data set, such as ImageNet. And then we use these features as our initialization. Then we continue to train the network on the NA birds data set in the process called fine-tuning. And fine-tuning actually works well in practice. So to show this, I've generated a toy example where we train two networks. We have our 19-layer model that we saw in the video. The red learning curves are the one pre-trained on ImageNet and then fine-tuned. And then the blue learning curves represent the randomly initialized network. So we have training accuracy on the y-axis and training time on the x-axis. And if we just look at the red learning curves, we see that the pre-trained network achieves higher accuracy faster. And this is generally the case for a lot of transfer learning applications. So now we see that this technique is promising, but we'd like to understand it even deeper. So now let's go back to our filter distributions. Now we take every representation of a class belonging to a data set, and we average them filter by filter, layer by layer, and we produce a single set of data set activations. And we'll do this for two networks. We have our 19-layer model, pre-trained on ImageNet but not yet fine-tuned, and the same 19-layer model fine-tuned on NA birds. These are our familiar data or filter distributions, but now I've sorted them by filter magnitude. And once I do that, the difference becomes clear. We get this steep drop-off shape after fine-tuning. Well, what this suggests is that the neurons in the network become more selective towards particular inputs after fine-tuning. And now we introduce this concept of sparsity in the network. Well, what do I mean by sparsity? Well, it's the proportion of neurons that don't fire when given a particular image. And to put that another way, it's neurons that on average produce zero output. And if we put a number on this sparsity, it turns out that following fine-tuning, sparsity increases in each layer on average by about 8.5%. So our diagnosis is that we have extraneous neurons, neurons that don't really serve much purpose. And we can take this even further by comparing our 19-layer model to a 16-layer model. And if we train them under the exact same conditions, and here I have the learning curves side by side, you can see, without really understanding the plots too much, that the performance is almost identical. So we actually didn't need those extra 3 layers all along. So not only do we have extraneous neurons, but now we have extraneous layers. And so this motivates the following idea, something I call guided dropout. So we set a threshold at, say, 0.3 in this image, and we set a rule that cuts off neurons. Essentially, any neurons whose activations fall below this threshold, we either reinitialize their weights to 0, or we cut them out of the network entirely. And we change this threshold and see the effects on network performance. To continue our brain analogy, this is sort of like synaptic pruning in the brain. So where have we been at this point? We learned that filters are the key structure of convolutional networks that formed the basis for the visual techniques that we used. And then we were able to traverse along the visual pathways for a convolutional network and learn some interesting phenomena regarding the features and classes as they're represented within the networks. And then having confidence in our visual techniques, we actually revealed some opportunities to improve the fine-tuning process. And that motivated the idea of guided dropout. So with that, I'd like to thank the Northrop Grumman Corporation for funding a SURF that had nothing to do with aerospace. And of course, my mentors, Pietro Perona and Joe Marino, for sticking out with me for another 3 or 4 months thanks to this competition. And thank you all for your attention.
We'd now like to open up for questions.
Yeah. In the back.
For your hens and koalas, how many training samples did you have?
For the hens and koalas, each image class in ImageNet tends to have about 1,000 images per class. Of course, that network was trained on the entire data set, and then I went back and fed those 2 classes back through the network or I would say, I guess, single out the effect or the activations due to those 2 classes. So 1,000 images per class. Yes?
So the training data set was pictures of animals, and then the one you were testing it on was pictures of birds.
Yes.
Which is a subset of animals.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, is the training more teaching pattern recognition, or is it more teaching it about animals?
We'd like to think it's more pattern recognition, and the reason being is, if you think back, let's try and find the slide real quick. The intuition behind why we might be able to go from one data set to another is, here we go, this idea, that some features are just general, they're independent of data sets, such as colors and lines. And in fact, the same people, Yasinski et al., actually were able to quantify, to a certain extent, the rate to which these features are generalizable. So of course, if we were to take the features like the scales of a fish or the feathers of a bird, we can't bring them from data set to data set, but the features that belong to the shallow layers are ones that are portable. And so that's the intuition behind going from ImageNet to AnyBirds.
Did we have one more? Okay, yes. Any more questions? Oh, thank you.
Thank you.